So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those not in Mexico. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Talbot. I am Notre Dame International's Director for Initiatives in Mexico. We're really glad you could join us today for today's Mexico virtual lecture. This is presented by Notre Dame's Mexico Global Center, and it's a series intended to highlight the relationship and partnerships between Notre Dame faculty and faculty in Mexico. So people working on, in, or with Mexico. Our guest today, of course, was a visiting fellow last semester at Notre Dame. So we're very glad that he could join us. The usual prefatory remarks and housekeeping, please keep your microphones on mute to prevent background noise. However, feel free to turn on your cameras. It's always great to see faces. Second, please submit any questions you have during the presentation via the chat or raise your virtual hand. I'll try my best to curate those, and Dr. Juarez will address them at the end of his presentation. So now to briefly introduce today's presenter, Dr. Julio Juarez was the first Fulbright Garcia Robles Comexis Mexico Studies Chair, that's a mouthful, at the University of Notre Dame this past fall. In addition to a partnership with Fulbright Comexis, this was also funded by a partnership between Notre Dame's Mexico Global Center and the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Dr. Juarez is a professor of political communication in the Centro de Investigaciones Interdisciplinarias en Ciencias y Humanidades at UNAM, the National Autonomous University. He conducts research on political advertising, mass media coverage of elections, electoral debates, and political communication. He is currently establishing an international network of scholars interested in political communication and electoral processes. He also conducts content analysis of organized crime in news reporting and monitors product placement in Mexican television. He has worked with top marketing research firms to analyze the political communication in the 2012 presidential election and carried out electoral observation projects under the supervision of the United Nations Development Program in Mexico's 2009 and 2012 federal elections. He has also previously worked as a senior advisor at the General Counsel's presidency at the National Electoral Institute. We are very excited to have Dr. Juarez with us today to share his work on populist narratives and electoral confidence. The timing in Mexico is obviously very relevant and a very important topic, but it's also important around the world in so many other countries. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Juarez. And with that, I'm going to hand the word over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this introduction. And obviously, thank you and the University of Notre Dame for inviting me over again. Apparently, I did something good during my stay in fall, so that we keep in touch. So I'm very happy to keep doing things with a university that now I consider also my second alma mater, and I'm very, very excited to give this presentation. And like you mentioned in your introduction, this couldn't be more timely. As some of you might know, next Sunday, the April 10, we will hold a presidential recall in Mexico, and I think it's an excellent moment to discuss some of the concepts and the theories that I will put on the table. And obviously, I'm more than happy to hear your comments, your questions, and to exchange perspectives and ideas on that subject. So, what I will do now, I will present three main concepts. The first one is electoral integrity. What do I mean by electoral integrity? What is the main definition of electoral integrity? Why it matters? And in second place, I will delve into populist narratives. What's the meaning and what's the way I understand populism from the political communication perspective, because populism, as you might know, it's a coin that has different values and it's used for so many different purposes. So I will try to pin those particular characteristics that I think are or make populism a very interesting concept to analyze. And the third one is obviously disinformation, that likewise has different definitions. It creates sometimes confusion regarding what's misinformation, what's disinformation, what's fake news, what's conspiracy theories. So we're going to get into that a little bit. And finally, I will close my presentation or my class today with a case study that has to do precisely with the recall, the electoral recall on next Sunday here in Mexico. So having said that, I will now share with you a presentation. Like Mike said, if there are any questions that like to be presented, I'm more than happy to address those, either at the time that those questions are presented or by the end of my presentation. So let's start, if you like. Right. So what is electoral integrity and why it matters? Let me put this into a bit of context. Of course, I will be mostly talking about the Mexican case and what's happening in Mexico right now. But this is not an exclusive pattern, unfortunately, that we have seen in countries with emerging, consolidating democracies. Many authors around the world have raised their voices and have put or called our attention into what is usually called a democratic backsliding, like democracies with well-established or long-standing democratic traditions are going backwards. Political leaders are looking through the rear-view mirror instead of the windshield. They are more focused on the past. They are trying to dismantle some of these institutions, and they are obviously putting these democratic institutions at risk. This very popular book, How Democracies Die, presents a very powerful argument, and that is in opposition to military coups that we saw during the 70s and the 60s. Now we have political leaders getting into power through democratic means, through legit democratic elections. And then once they are in power, they try to dismantle all these institutions. So they are trying to impose an authoritarian regime where there were democratic foundations. So that's obviously very worrying. Mexico is not the only country that's facing this. Of course, the United States has faced this problem for the last couple of years. But we have seen this phenomenon in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, and it's highly concerning in terms of what's going to happen and whether these democracies are strong enough. They have the institutions to block, to stop, and to prevent this backward or this backsliding to happen. So there is growing disaffection and cynicism towards all things political. People are fed up with politicians, discourse, advertising. They are simply looking the other way. But politicians are making a profit out of it. There's suspicion also regarding democratic procedures, even in those countries where elections were not usually challenged. And in particular with countries like in the case of Mexico, where we coming from an authoritarian past with only perhaps 20 years of rather functional democratic procedures, we still have this the shadow of rigged elections and the lack of trust in electoral processes. People are distrusting the media, legacy media, traditional media, newspapers, radio, television are usually blamed as being part of the problem. The same with NGOs and all other institutions that are part of the state. So people are putting some distance between their beliefs and what's happening in the state or in different administrations. And therefore, some of these direct democracy methods are becoming very popular. To put to a vote very flashy ideas, questions that might seem to resolve very difficult and long-held problems, and are now put onto a vote under the name of direct democracy. And populism fits this description perfectly because it simplifies social reality. So it allows people to think, or it makes people think or believe that big problems can be solved with just popular will and with a clear yes or no answer. And so this is part of the context in which I will be addressing this notion of electoral integrity. For those who are not specialists in electoral studies or in elections, what electoral integrity basically refers to is the standardized international norms and guidelines to conduct elections. And that means at least 11 big stages during the electoral process. I won't get into detail of each and every one of these, but they are all equally important and relevant in terms of explaining to people how elections are run. Most people don't know how elections, and they don't care how elections are run, organized, qualified, overseen, and et cetera, et cetera. So that doesn't mean that these are not important stages and these are not relevant processes that need to be taken care of. So the sum of all these steps, of all these processes, is basically called electoral integrity. And that goes from the way electoral laws are approved by Congress, the small procedures, the day-to-day actions that electoral management bodies, EMBs, take during an election, the district boundaries for electoral votes, registration of candidates, the way parties and candidates access the media, the way the finances of these candidates and political parties are overseen, the way the voting process is taken, how votes are counted, and how results and when are results given to the public or made public. And obviously, a very important one, which I would refer to directly, it's the constitution or the implementation or the creation of electoral administration or electoral management bodies. In the case of Mexico, we come, as I said, from a very disruptive democratic electoral past, in which the government was, with one hand, competing for power and with the other hand, organizing and counting the votes. So obviously that system collapsed in 1988. I won't go into long history now, but from then on, Mexican political parties and politicians compromised with creating institutions that could allow at least to avoid having a political problem, a political oriented crisis. So they created a federal electoral institute in 1991, which is now 31 years old, which is the basis of what is called now INE, which is National Electoral Institute. At the time was called Federal Electoral Institute, and was reformed 8 years ago to change its name and centralize some of the federalized functions, electoral functions, and now under the control of the INE. What this body does, like many others around the world, particularly in federalist countries like Brazil or Canada, is they're based upon independence, in centralization, and that is the necessary degree of control over certain practices, bureaucratization, that is the implementation of steps and guidelines and benchmarks for organizing elections the same way around and across a very diverse and complex country like Mexico, delegation of certain activities and certain responsibilities to local electoral bodies, and the degree of specialization that these electoral bodies need to comply with all their constitutional requirements. And of course, the way they implement and interpret sometimes regulation that is sometimes ineffective or has lots of gray areas or loopholes that legislators didn't have the time to fill, and that sometimes electoral bodies need to interpret those and try to fill those loopholes when it comes to organize the election on a daily basis. So having said that, looking at the BDEM data from the Kellogg Institute, you can see that the electoral management body autonomy in Mexico has changed dramatically since that particular crossroad in 1988, and it has gone above the Latin American standard in terms of the degree of autonomy that this body has. That is the constitutional autonomy to take decisions upon budgets, electoral bureaucratic processes, and a large, etc. So another variable that I wanted to show you was the capacity, the technical capacity, and Mexico has one of the highest ranked electoral bodies in terms of compared to their more similar countries like the rest of Latin American countries, our Latin neighbors, and we rank higher than many of them in terms of the degree of technical capacity that our electoral management body has. So this has to do with a very certain truth, that is, Mexican elections come, or our electoral system is based on the basis of distrust. Basically, no one used to trust elections, so we had to build a very comprehensive electoral law. We have to devise lots of checks and balances for elections to be taken seriously, and to provide stability and to guarantee the peaceful transition of power in a country that has many long-standing problems, one of them criminal violence, and we couldn't afford to have a political problem on top of all these other problems. So this has happened over the last 20 years, and I think the INE and IFE first, and now INE has done a very efficient job. Of course, there are obviously many lessons to be yet learned and implemented, but so far we haven't had a political crisis in Mexico precisely because these strong institutions, not just INE, but also a federal tribunal that qualifies elections and that depends on the judiciary branch, and that has provided Mexico with certain political stability. Now that is a bit of that is at risk, and I will explain why. Let me put that introduction into the back burner so I can address populism as a communication style. Power needs storytelling. You need, as a politician, as a political party, as someone that is governing, you need to convey meaning through storytelling. You need to tell a story that convinces or that explains and justifies your actions and your decisions. Your legitimacy, your rightful exercise of power depends on your capacity to transfer meaning to those political actions. This is one of the key elements in terms of political communication regarding the exercise of power. And to do so, to create this narrative, you need to use language. Language is the primal ingredient of political discourse. And with language, you can build and create expectations, but you can also demolish and degrade institutions. And that's when populism sometimes takes this language, or uses storytelling to dismantle political institutions. What happens? That's the question I present at the start of our conversation today. When political storytelling seeks not to construct or to build or to present an expectation about the future, but what happens when it seeks to polarize, to antagonize, to stigmatize those who oppose your views, or those who are not considered part of your party or your ideological group. Sometimes we assume that politicians have a political interest and that therefore there's some degree of justification, like they're trying to bend things their way, they're trying to tell their story, they're trying to sell a nice image of their government or their promises for power, control, domination, whatever those excuses, it's taken for granted somehow. But the question here is, how can we understand citizen responses to populism and polarization? When are we, when we are observing a country in which a large majority of people are buying these narratives, are actually following through these intentions to dismantle political and democratic institutions, we need to question where are those minds, where are those citizens, or why are they thinking the way they are thinking? Why are they providing their support to certain narratives that seem to dismantle democracy instead of strengthening? Of course, the discourse is quite the opposite. All these changes and initiatives are made to strengthen and to bring true democracy and et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, if we look at those from a more objective point of view, we find that what all these reforms, all these intentions are meant to increase control and diminish opposition or opposite views. So what is populist communication? How can we define it? First of all, it's a binary explanation of social reality. Like I said that before. It's very simple. It's what I call taxi driver philosophy. Like, reality can be explained in blacks and whites, and you can just in a phrase or in a brief summary have a complete picture of the world and the things that need to be done to solve those problems and to fix those complex situations that haven't been solved in the past. So it's not just a binary explanation. It's based on the people in this idea, in this entity that is homogeneous, like a group of people that just because they are pueblo, they are part of the people, they think the same, they have the same values, and they are good in essence, and are confronted before a corrupt elite. Populism takes always for granted that the large majority of people have been oppressed by a corrupt and perverse elite. And therefore, they are anti-elitist in any form or activity of social life. It doesn't matter if you are a politician from the opposition, you belong to a corrupt elite. It doesn't matter if you are an academic and work in a university. If you don't applaud what the government does or says, you are also part of an elite and also are corrupt in itself. If you are part of an NGO or an activist movement, a social activist, you are part of that elite. And it's very simple to just polarize and antagonize these groups. Those who belong to the people, those who are true members of the people, and those who belong to these corrupt, selfish elites. The very idea of populism is rooted in the notion of a unified popular will that a leader can interpret himself or herself. That is not only there is this homogeneous group of people, but the will of this homogeneous group of people can be interpreted, can be read, can be seen, felt by this particular leader. So he or she is able to interpret and to translate the true needs and the true wants from that group of people that he or she governs. It's usually activated by external threats and injustices. Populism without a threat is not populism as such. It needs to convey the idea of someone taking away, or that someone took away already those pristine goods that belong to the people and took away those dreams and those goals and basically robbed the people from a future, and it needs to remind people constantly that there is an injustice on our doorstep, or that there has been an injustice in the past that we need to repair it. So it feeds upon grievances. Populism is very backward in terms of creating all this permanently the sense of loss. We lost something, or we are about to lose something, and we have to do something about it. And it's centered, of course, in pointing out those culprits that are responsible for these robberies or these threats. Either they could be immigrants coming to our country to take away things from us, or they could be this corrupt elite that took away our riches and sold them, or just for their own benefit, they betrayed the will of the people. So, as you can see, these are very convincing arguments for certain countries, in particular those countries that comply with certain predispositions. And I want you to think of populism or populist communication in terms of market logics, offer and demand, or offer and supply. Demand and supply, sorry. And that is, we usually label or criticize or signal a politician that communicates with these populist narratives, that is using all these populist elements in their narratives. But we have to also look not just the offer of populist discourses, but also a demand of populist discourses. And there are lots of people in society with very good reasons, I have to say, to buy and to demand these kind of discourses, because they feel that the democracy hasn't done justice for them, that the actual conditions are completely unfair, that they are being left out of this capitalist, liberal or neoliberal logics, and the way the markets and organizations are constructed. They have lost, and they want a payback. And it's very understandable. Like I said, you have demographic factors explaining why people, or what kind of people are buying or are eager to buy these populist narratives. There are obviously psychological factors, shortage of resources, a sense of belonging, also like a sense of being part of a community has been damaged by this corrupt elite, and also information factors, of course. Now that we live in a digital age where we have many media outlets exploiting the figure of populism, adopting a populist narrative in their own news agenda. So creating the notion and reinforcing our views about how unfair and how this corrupt elite is taking away things from us, or the will to take these things away from us. So at a country level, we have, obviously, in countries like Mexico, a very fragile economy. The amount of people living under the poverty line remains huge and growing, especially after the pandemic. So it's no wonder why many people here are buying this narrative of the culprits, of those who took away things from us, and we need to take those things back. Even if in the process we need to dismantle of these electoral or these democratic institutions, including, for instance, freedom of speech. There are obviously factors related to migration or the success that populist parties are having all over the world, and the level of trust of institutions. Latin America in general has proven to be a society, or societies in Latin America have proven to be distrustful of the government and public officials, and especially public institutions and governments, because experience tells us that someone is lying and that you cannot trust fully on the intentions and motives of those in power. So what are the citizen responses to these populist narratives? I'm not just only focusing, as you can see, in the content of the populist narrative, but also in the effects the reception of these messages have on people, real people like you and me. First of all, emotional responses, anxiety before threats. People are anxious about something that's going to happen, whether it's a caravan of migrants coming to your country or whether it's the powerful elite controlling everything so they can come back to power and steal anything or everything away from you. An in-group attachment. They feel strongly connected with those who think the same, those who have already be considered part of this in-group that is claiming these atrocities, these injustices, and they create very strong bonds, either by digital conversations or in person. And you create, understandably, a great anger against these outgroups, against those who don't belong to your in-group, and those who are one day and the other signaled or pointed out as those responsible for all the injustices that have been presented to the people in general. So these are three findings that research on populism has found in the past in terms of the emotional effects it has on people, but also it has cognitive effects, that is, in the way people perceive and understand the world. There's a permanent sense of crisis, and it's documented in information, news, stories, constant conversations around what the things that are going to occur. A permanent focus on the shortages. It's like thinking all the time in the things that you don't have and that have been taken away from you or that could be taken away from you, instead of thinking 360 degrees in terms of those things that not necessarily are at risk. You are only thinking in those things, or your primal concern is about those things that are under threat or your shortages, and blames towards that outgroup. And the third one is attitudinal. Those emotions, those ideas, those concepts translate into attitudes and eventually into behavior. You have a positive image of your in-group. You are trying only to make justice, and your peers, those who belong to your own group, are trying are fighting for justice. You have a complete negative image of that outgroup. It doesn't matter if that outgroup actually exists as such. You just created this picture of your in-group, which obviously homogenizes as well your own persona with the ones around you, just because it's like thinking of supporting one team, one sports team, and then thinking that everyone supporting that team thinks the same about everything else. And it's more or less the same in terms of political populism, that you think that just because you feel injustice and the other one feels injustice, and I feel identified with one particular leader or political party, you are all think the same in terms of everything else and all the issues that are part of society, which is incredibly improbable, because there are many things occurring and there are many ideas and moral perspectives regarding the world. So, but that's an attitudinal adoption that it's a consequence of populist narratives. And obviously populist attitudes, stigmatization, the categorization of others, stereotyping, like those in-groups and out-groups are characterized by certain elements, ways of doing things or thinking, of dressing, or pretty much everything. And it tends to categorize people and to simplify and objectify human beings. Not just the out-group, but also you as an in-group are objectified. You belong to someone else or someone else's ideas. So that's regarding populism. Tell me, Mike, if I'm not, if I'm on time, you will let me know, right? If I keep talking for 2 days,
I'll let you know. I'll let you know. We want to make sure to leave time for some questions, though. I think we're already getting some in.
Excellent. So, okay. So I'll move into the myth now and follow into the final part of my presentation. So this is, I'm addressing now disinformation. So this is a picture of following the Digital News Report 2020 done by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. This is a picture of digital news consumption in different regions of the world. As you can see, Latin America has the highest use of Facebook as a source of information, not just entertainment or social contact, but as a source of news gathering. And WhatsApp is, compared to, for instance, North America, in this case, the United States, it's a very powerful tool for news consumption. And this obviously has an impact as well in the way sometimes disinformation is transmitted, because it usually, you can hear sometimes people blaming the Russian algorithm or the hidden composition of the code that upon which some of these social media are written that is spreading disinformation. And more often than not, it's real people sharing posts and sharing information that is not verified that are amplifying disinformation, and not all these algorithms or these artificial intelligence bots. So this is important to put in light. I just wanted to present this as an introduction for what I'm going to say afterwards, because there is a crisis of communication as well. People, I said in the beginning, are distrusting politicians in general. They are distrusting political parties, but they're also distrusting government. And they actually think, according to this report from the Reuters Institute, that most of the lies or the disinformation or misleading information comes directly from the government. That's the case of pretty much the same between Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, above the world average. So we consider our governments a very trustable source of misinformation or disinformation. And that's very worrying, because the third one is journalists and news organizations. So we don't trust our government, and sometimes we, or more often than not, we don't trust our journalists, and we don't trust newspapers or networks or radio stations. So that's why the emergence of new communication spaces in YouTube, the openness of opportunities for anyone who wants to tell the truth and to create their own news show and to present the real things that are actually occurring, because anyone else or the big media don't want you to know, are free. They have sometimes a blank check to just present whatever they feel might fit the idea. And following the notion of John Stuart Mill's of democracy as a market of ideas. So you go out and freely choose whatever you want to believe in, and the things that you want to fight for, and those things that you consider to be worth defending in democracy, faces now in a digital era where the intermediate, which was the news organization or the journalist, has been displaced. And now you have direct communication with others, which is great, of course, and opens the opportunity for people to communicate and engage with different voices, and has taken away the monopoly of communication and news control by all these corporations, which is, like I said, a very good opportunity for amplifying the options for gathering information. It has opened the door also for all these other misconceptions about what communication is. So I just want to clarify, or to put into perspective, because all these terms are sometimes used equally, like the same coin, and there are different things. So I will stick to the disinformation concept as the main umbrella concept upon or under which you can find all these other subcategories. The first one, of course, you have heard this many times before: fake news, which can be used as a genre, which is more like those media oriented to create satire, political satire or parody. That's nothing new. That's part of comedy or the way to just criticize government or politicians. Or also fake news as a label, as a way to discredit your critics and to discredit those journalists that are publishing things against you or against your government. And the only way you can minimize what they're found or their findings or their stories is to label them as fake news. The second one is misinformation, which is basically being ill-informed. It's characterized by the lack of intent. Being misinformed usually implies that the people misinforming is actually not aware of the inaccuracies that he or she is presenting. And sometimes that creates the confusion between misinformation and disinformation, whereas disinformation relates directly, like we're going to see a definition afterwards, with the intent to position false information when those spokespeople or those spokespersons know exactly what they're saying. So media manipulation is another one, which is more related to the manufacture of consent, this classic book of Herman and Chomsky regarding a powerful status quo that wants to control everything, that blends media and political interests into controlling society. That comes from critical theory, of course. Conspiracy theories that are hyperbolic narratives based on casual agency of small groups that are controlling everything from the basement. And of course, propaganda, which is ideologically charged and biased information. So you select certain bits and pieces of information and you frame those into a value charged interpretation of the world. That's more or less propaganda. So all those notions or categories are under the umbrella or the conceptual umbrella of disinformation. So what is disinformation? All forms of false, inaccurate, misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. So that's the definition that the European Commission came up with across the high-level expert group on fake news and disinformation in 2018. So basically, the difference between all the others, the key element is the deliberate effort to confuse and to distort reality. Of course, there are passive and active components of disinformation, those who are disinformed by just receiving passive information or passively, or those who actively share. And this is where what our colleagues found in this very interesting paper about the participation paradox. Communication scholars and political scientists often complain with the lack of participation and the lack of interest in society with political processes. So what has been discovered is that those who participate in politics, those who are really engaged, are those actually more responsible for sharing and amplifying disinformation. So it's a paradox because you want people to participate, right? You want people to be active. You want people to engage in conversation, to post things, to like, to retweet, to share information. But the problem comes when that information is not verified or it's openly false, and people are doing that because they are naive or gullible, or simply because those informations fit their own values and their own ideas. So how does disinformation work? Basically, human beings, we are hardwired for believing things. Our brains are designed to believe any stimulus that comes our way. And in a second thought, we tend to be more distrustful. But in the beginning, that's why we are very gullible sometimes in terms of the information that arrives to us. And that has nothing to do with being ignorant or being naive. It has to do with the way our brains are designed. And so this creates another paradox because people tend to believe false information. And when someone comes, the government, a journalist group, an NGO, to verify that information and to tell you that that information is false, you are suspicious. So you believe the first one, the first part, but when the second bit comes, it's like, oh, I'm not sure. Why are you telling me this? Why are you trying to clarify that information that was presented in a very natural way? So it creates a problem for those efforts that try to verify. I'm imagining you have seen an electoral debate where there are fact checking going on live, and people tend to distrust those verifiers because they are happy sometimes with the information they're receiving, especially when you find these two psychological models. The first one is the illusory truth effect. Once a lie is repeated, this is the Goebbels chant. You repeat a lie many times as long as until it becomes truth, and it's based on real psychology, and people start to believe something that is being repeated again and again, and it creates a gullible or feeds upon or preys upon our gullibility to believe this information once it's repeated again and again. And there's also this, which is, I think, more powerful, the confirmation bias. You believe the things that you consider to be more related to your own ideas and to your own identity. Populist attitudes make people, in fact, more vulnerable to this information. When you share these populist ideas, when you buy those, when you demand those types of narratives to understand the world, when you expect politicians to explain clear and simple what's going on in the world, it's more likely that you will be believing this information, that you will be vulnerable to be disinformed. And especially so when moral convictions enter the picture, when those things that have been discussed touch something very personal, those things that are non-negotiable for anyone, those beliefs that are centered of your identity. And those moral convictions have been tested by different research. I just mentioned here 2 papers published by the Political Psychology journal, which are very interesting in terms of how moral convictions heighten our defense and our need to believe what we think it's right, and disregarding the nature and the truthfulness of those alleged facts or ideas. So as long as those informations confirm my own moral convictions and they are in line with my own ideological view of the world, I will be more inclined to believe those messages. And populist communication preys upon that combination of factors. So now I move into the final. This is my final slide. And I mentioned at the beginning, we have this presidential recall on Sunday. This is an ongoing public debate for at least September of 2021. President López Obrador has been very vocal against the National Electoral Institute since he got into power in December 2018. And this is obviously a contradiction because he was a leader that was popularly elected in 2018 for 6 years. That's his term. There's no re-election in Mexico in the Mexican Constitution. So he has a 6-year term. And he was beneficiary of a very solid electoral process. His party won a majority of seats in the midterm elections in last year in 2021. Morena governs in different countries, in different states within the country. So there hasn't been anyone more benefit by this electoral system than the president and his party, and yet he one day and the other criticizes the people running the INE and the procedures and the the need for a true democracy and the need to remove these councillors, these bureaucrats, these remains of the past, and to install a new era of true democracy. So this is obviously worrying to a very high degree. So, and this is just for starters. So it's not surprised that this president, which has a very strong popularity, over 60% in most election polls or most polling that has been published, and he and his party are promoting his own recall. Of course, they don't call it recall; they call it a ratification. What they want to do is free opportunities to promote his image, because we have a presidential election in 2024. And this is the beginning of that election, because most party officials rely on AMLO's image, which is very profitable, politically speaking. And the president knows that, and they know that, and they're trying to make this recall a case for reaffirming his position as the political leader in Mexico. So in the process, there have been at least 5 elements that I could point out here. There are many more, but I just wanted to highlight this, that align with not just the populist narrative, but also with the electoral integrity narrative, because the discourse of the president has been directed to diminish the autonomy and the electoral integrity of a process in which he might be favored in the end, like he was being favored in the past, and just under the excuse to remove everything and to justify his own ideas and his own diagnosis of what's wrong with Mexican democracy. So the INE has faced budgetary constraints, so they can't fulfill their constitutional duties. INE will be forced to place only 1/3 of polling stations because the lack of budget, and the budget that has been denied by Congress for INE to be able to prepare and to capacitate everyone, all the citizens that need to install these polling stations. There's a judicial lawsuit presented by the president of the Congress, the lower house, against 6 councillors, because they voted this resolution in light of the short budgetary constraints they had, and because they had to vote that INE it's ruled by a council of 11 members council, and all decisions are publicly voted, and those 6 councillors voted to just install 1/3 of the polling stations. So the president of Congress presented a judicial action, a lawsuit against them. They tried to, they actually amended the electoral law so public officials could promote with public resources the recall. And I'm showing just one of the examples, billboards across the country that are claimed to be paid by citizens that really want to support their president. So it's very ironic what's going on, because you have a president and you have supporters claiming that we want him to stay. He has to stay. He won a 6-year term, so he's not going anywhere. I mean, no one wants him to go, unless that you want to create the illusion that you need to go and vote and ratify that you want him to stay. And that's more or less the narrative that Morena and López Obrador are presenting right now. So there are complaints presented formally, and the INE has to deal with those complaints about the illegal use of public money for promoting this recall. And also there have been always suggestions of an electoral reform, and now those ideas have just increased. And now the president the other day mentioned that he wants the people to elect all these public officials so they can run trustable and true elections. And we already know what that means. But I will leave it there, because I'm imagining there will be some questions and comments from the audience. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't extended my presentation too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. That was a fascinating presentation, and really great to see how these different topics and themes, literatures overlap and really engage with one another. So let's remind everyone, feel free to submit questions via the chat, where you can press the raise hand button on the screen and then unmute. First question comes in from Gabriela. She thanks you for your presentation. She asks, would you share your thoughts, please, about how political parties participate in the Mexican electoral governance and how they can be responsible for the democracy prospects? For example, would the parties in the legislature be able to control each other through the appointment of EMB members in a kind of watchdog power sharing model of electoral governance?
Yeah. Do you want to take one by one?
Sure, I'll go ahead and do the second one as well, which comes from Fortunato. He says he would love to hear your opinion on Sunday's electoral day, since in his opinion, AMLO will not lose, not only because he will use the few people who will vote to argument, attack the INE, but also he might argue people do not want him to leave.
Okay.
And then I'm going to add a third, which is the moderator's preference of my own, if you don't mind. I'm curious how voter turnout fits into these narratives as well, right? Because we get a situation, and I'm not making any predictions about Sunday, but we get a situation where someone says, I received 80% of the vote, and the other side says, but only 20% of those eligible voted. I'm obviously just making those numbers up. How does that narrative of support for whichever political party you want fit in with the narrative of voter turnout?
Thank you. Well, these are all very, very interesting questions. Let me start with the first one. Of course, opposition parties play a big role here, and they should, of course, and they have in the past. Even when many of the now government officials were in the opposition. I think the last crisis we had in Congress needs to appoint the 11-member council. So to do so, you need 2/3 of Congress voting the names of those who will occupy these positions. And that implies a political negotiation. It's no surprise that you need two politicians across the aisle to sit down and to, put these names on the table and to try to come to terms with the positions of those who political parties are or feel more comfortable with, because they have a previous relation, because they don't consider them a threat to their own political interests. So that's part of a negotiation, and I think that's what politics is all about. That you need to negotiate these things in a transparent and in a fair way. We had a crisis in 2005 and 2003, when some of these councillors were appointed without the participation of one of the big three political parties at the time, the left wing, PRD, and they were left out of the negotiation. Of course, they decried that the election, the next election would be rigged because they didn't have a say in who would occupy this position in Congress. And that's exactly what happened in 2006. Just for memorabilia, at the time, the candidate of the PRD was Andrés Manuel López Obrador. It's the first presidential election he lost. And with or without reason, because sometimes politicians will play the card that you have to designate those councillors and that will secure you a victory. And that's a complete lie, because once you know the INE from within, and once you are aware that INE is more than just 11 people, that you have actual citizens, and that's the constitutional design of elections in Mexico. It's very different from the model in the United States, where you have public officials organizing the elections. Here you are basically called as a citizen to run your election poll with your neighbors. And you are trained by the INE, but you are in charge of your election. I was actually, luckily, in the 2021 election last year, I was the president of my polling station. And back there in my office, you can see my books and everything. And all the ballots and the materials were there the night before, because the people from the INE, they delivered those packages to the president of the polling station. So those slept there, properly sealed and everything. I was in charge to take those and walk a couple of blocks and install the polling station with people I didn't know, but that are part of my community. That's, I would say, the main strength of INE. It's not the counselors, it's not the people that you see making or giving interviews or that have obviously a political visibility. It's the people like us and people that have different ideological positions and are favor different political parties and are have different ideas about many things that are in charge of running that. And that, I think, as a Mexican, it's a matter of pride to say that those are one of the few moments in which you actually think that you are doing something for your country. Like you are really feeling that you're putting that grain of sand in a larger thing. And it's very, very comforting to see that. So political opposition parties are very important in the mix. We haven't had an electoral reform since then that hasn't been integrated or approved by all political parties. And that's key. That's a very relevant and significant element of electoral laws in Mexico, that there has to be a consensus regarding all these modifications, because the degree of distrust, and I remember explaining that to my students in Notre Dame last semester. I said, guys, you used to trust your electoral system. Now you are distrusting it because, the way you do elections in the US, if we did that here in Mexico, we had like 25 revolutions already. Like there's no way people will trust the way, every state has, its own registry of voters. That here will create a chaos. So you have a very concentrated electoral system, registry, all these controls. The parties are all the time observing and they're part of it. So anyway, just to clarify, it's very important to have both opposition parties and the party in power being involved in this, because we don't trust elections and we have to be part of that. That's our paradox right now. And therefore, that's why it's so important to choose the right people that will be and have a degree of autonomy when it comes to both things that will actually sometimes go against the interest of those who initially offered you support for you to occupy that space. So you have to be very clear on that. So once I'm sitting there, I'm going to do my job. If that means hurting your political interest, I'm just going to abide by what the law says. And I think we need to keep pushing on that. So what's going to happen on Sunday? I think from what I've seen and the polling I've encountered and conversations and the political narrative that I have observed, López Obrador will try to build or blame INE for the lack of participation. It doesn't matter if you have many people participating or just a few, or the expectations are not met. Whatever their calculations the government is making, they're going to blame the INE because they're already blaming it for not promoting the recall, for not applauding this exercise, while it has been quite the contrary. Given the electoral laws here in Mexico, the INE is the only institution legally authorized to promote the recall, and they have lots of evidence, objective evidence that they have been doing that through digital platforms and, of course, radio and television, because they count with state time for doing so. So it's just an excuse, and I am afraid that what they want to do is diminish the power and the credibility of the INE, because they want a weak electoral body for the 2024 presidential election. And this is not the beginning, but this is the next step they are trying to to give in terms of denting the autonomy of the institution and waiting for a takeover of the electoral institution. And that's obviously very worrying. So that's what's going to happen in terms of the political meaning that Morena and the president is going to give to the recall. It's very unlikely that he won't get the support he's asking or he's looking for. It's in order to be legally binding, the recall needs a 40% participation of the registry. So that means if we have more or less 93 million people registered to vote here in Mexico. So to get the 40% is around 32, 33 million people. To get those results translated into legal action. That means if he loses the recall, he will have to go and step down, which is, like I said, very, very unlikely. Or if he wins, he will get this ratification. Either way, I don't expect the Morena or the president to get this 40% participation. I will go for something well below that. That doesn't mean that the government now is not pressing the governors and public officials to promote and to get the vote out. So we have witnessed here a state operation, and it's very sad to corroborate that despite all the narrative of transformation and that this was a new era of Mexican politics, what we have seen on the streets and what we have seen on actual terms is a state operation to get the people out to vote. And that means using public resources, that means pressing people, that means blackmailing people who get benefits from the government to get Morena officials at your place, at your home, asking you to, well, now you got this scholarship, this support from the government, now we want you to go and vote and ratify the president. So it's very worrying, and let's wait and see. I can only hope for Sunday to be a calm day, not a violent day. I'm expecting, because we haven't had, and this is something very strange in Mexico. It's a very violent country surrounded by a crisis of cartels and many other things in across different states. But when it comes to the election day, it's very unusual to find acts of violence. Those isolated incidents haven't represented a threat to elections. So what I'm trying to say is, right now we don't have a political problem. Let's hope we continue that way, because I'm not sure what are we going to do if we add a political problem or political instability to all the other problems that we do have. So this is what I think would be the main lesson to be learned here. And what is actually this recall fixing? What is actually solving? What problem is actually addressing? So some people who are against or are not favorable of President López Obrador are willing to, they want him to go. And rightfully, because it's the right, they will go out and vote for him to leave. Whenever I find someone like that, I ask him or ask her, do you know who's going to take charge if he gets recalled? No, well, but there will be a new election. Yeah, of course there will be a new election. Who is going to take charge? The president of the House of Deputies, which is a Morena official appointed by the president, which will create instability and will open the door for other conflicts of power within Morena. So it will create a political crisis. Of course, we don't want him to go. He's there for 6 years, and that's one of the very few political certainties that we as Mexicans have, that the 6-year term, that the sexenio lasts 6 years. It's part of our history. It can be a good or a bad government, but we know it's going to be there for 6 years, and then this person will leave. And now these ideas of re-election, of he's going, he's staying, or he will quit now and he will come back later. So everyone is like a bit suspicious and a bit anxious about what's going to happen. So my guess is they won't get the 40%, but this is an ongoing thing. So it won't stop there, and the attacks on the INE and their the councillors will continue and will increase. So they're going to take this to the limit. So that's very worrying.
Thank you, Julio. And you anticipated the question that was in there, or maybe you saw the chat and anticipated the question of, in the unlikely situation that AMLO loses, what happens? If any lesson has been learned in the past decade, it's that surprises happen in elections sometimes. And so it's worth thinking through what those implications would be as well. Many words of appreciation in the chat. I echo that. I think this was a very important conversation. I do have another question, although thinking more about the United States, frankly, than Mexico. Obviously, conversations about electoral integrity have been common and frequent over the past several years. And part of them revolve around how quickly we learn the results, right? 2000 is obviously the most extreme example, where we had to wait weeks, but even in this past election, we had to wait days. And that seems to undermine people's confidence in the results, which is a little odd when you think about it, because in many countries in the world, it takes time to count votes. It certainly is true over the history of elections. But if we don't know, by midnight on the night of elections, people start saying fraud. And of course, now they're pulling in question the voting machines and things that would actually make counting faster, saying, well, we should go to paper ballots. So you have this tension between the reliability and the speed with which you can find out results. I'm curious your thoughts on what that speed of knowing the results and how that affects confidence in elections. I'm obviously thinking of the US example, but I think you could take this elsewhere as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's an excellent point. And most democracies will have the necessary patience to wait for the results, even if those results come 2 or 3 days after the election. In countries like Mexico, where the levels of distrust are very high, we had to devise a way to inform by an official manner, the way the election is going. So as an American citizen, the night of the election, you will wait for the networks to announce the winner, right? If that would happen in Mexico, that would be, again, a crisis, because the networks are perceived as part of the government and the politicians' machinery. So it's like, no, don't trust them. Actually, the law forbids anyone to publish any polling study or I forgot the name now. It's those elections those polls that are taken out.
Exit polls, I think is what.
Exit polls. Sorry, yeah, that's the word. Exit polls. So exit polls are forbidden. There's a threshold of time that you can start announcing those, but you can't do that before the polling stations close. And the only authority authorized to announce the results the very night of the election is the INE, is the Electoral Authority. And for that, they have devised a very sophisticated sampling method that we call the quick count. And the quick count basically selects a number of polling stations across the nation, which are secret, which only those personnel from the INE that will operate those polling stations, that will coordinate those polling stations with the citizens, the presidents of those polling stations, will know the very same day that they have one of those polling stations, that will feed the data into this statistical model that a group of scientists from different universities will be literally held into a bunker in the INE, with the only ones who have access to these polling results from this sample that is very sophisticated in terms of the accuracy that it tries to present. And they will come with a quick count. And the quick count presents a range that of votes that that candidate A will get, or candidate B or candidate C. And with those data, with that information, once it's done, once it's approved by this scientific committee, will be delivered to the president of the INE by hand, secretly, so only he can know, and then he will announce the results. So it sounds a bit like 19th century kind of process, but it allows certainty in terms of the degree of official weight those results have. And that has to be happening during the night of the election. Of course, there are recounts, and there might be this range will be verified the following Wednesday, which is where the council, all the councils across the country will open and will verify it, and will do the hard working of counting, paper ballots, which is actually the way votes are counted here. So when it comes to the US, it's a completely different scenario, because you have the polling stations, or you have the polling from the networks creating all this data, and then if there are some difficulties in counting or different procedures depending on the county or the state, you will have to wait. And we saw that in the last election. It wasn't a problem in the past. People used to wait and say, well, okay, well, results. Remember Florida. And that created a lot of anxiety. And the recount, of course, because given the constitutional design and the Electoral College, of course, created all this attention on Florida, because that will decide the election between Gore and Bush. So eventually what happened in countries where distrust is very high, that you need to have the results that very same night. Otherwise, it's like, cats and dogs. So, yeah, I hope I
Thank you for that.
That's a very good point.
So we have another question here from Maria Jose. She asks, if one of the main objectives of the recall on this Sunday is in some terms to disqualify INE, what can we do as Mexican society? It's a big question for you.
Sure, of course, that's a very good question. I don't want to sound naive in my answer, because I'm also a citizen, or I'm just a citizen equally concerned. But I think we need to defend our institutions. I think something we have gained over the last 3 decades is some institutions that are working and are actually getting now the back of many people that didn't care much about the electoral institutions. Now you see people discussing and trying to protect INE. People that didn't care much about electoral institutions or elections at all, now they perceive. And I think that the main responsible for that is AMLO, the president. He has been so vicious and so critical of these electoral bodies that he has raised the profile of not just the councillors, but also of the very institution that guarantees certain political peace and stability. So I think what we have to do, I personally, I won't vote. And this is something important in terms of this type of direct democracy exercises, because the fact that you have a 40% threshold for the results to be translated into legal action, it means that if you don't vote, you're voting against that effectiveness. It's not when you are not voting because you can't be bothered and someone else is going to take a decision for you, right? You're just an absentee ballot that won't count, but someone else will decide that vote. In this case, it's different, because if you don't go and vote, if you don't help, if you don't contribute to that threshold, the message you are sending is, I don't believe in this exercise, and I don't want it to be to have a legal meaning. I want this to be an empty exercise. So this is, I think, the only time when not voting is actually an active way to discredit a consultation. So I think that's very important in terms of the decisions that people want to make. I'm not usually, I don't use to tell people what to do. This is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to participate because of that. And we need to keep defending. And by that, I mean speaking and talking to our people, the people we discuss things with, our family, our friends, the people around us, and to present all the complexity of politics, not just the simplicity of populist narratives between good and evil or between black and white. I think our responsibility is to create and to raise the importance of not having a political crisis in 2024. We won't have a political crisis next Sunday, of course, because it's just a recall, and I'm expecting the president will stay and remain until 2024, and then he will leave. But then we have a presidential election, and we want a strong electoral management body running that election, because that's going to be the mother of all battles for Mexican democracy, like it is for many other democracies around the world. So we want a strong, independent, autonomous, rigorous, transparent electoral authority. And that's, I think, what that should be our aim as citizens of this country. I sound like a politician now. I'm in campaign. Sorry, my fellow citizens.
So we're coming up on time, and that I think is a very strong way to end this conversation. So let me thank you one last time, Julio, for accepting this invitation to speak with us today, and let me thank everyone that joined us for engaging in this conversation. Hopefully, it'll be just one in many to come as Julio remains a part of the Notre Dame family. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. I haven't had the time to reply, but I appreciate that, and I've read. So thank you so much, and take care.
Take care, everyone.
See you soon. Thank you, Mike.